we would make a real mistake to keep on underestimating China's power for the next few years as we have done so consistently for the last 25 years. We face this predicament today because we've underestimated China's power for so long. And I might say we've overestimated the United States. For too long, we've taken it for granted that the United States is, by definition, the world's strongest state. By definition, has the military power to do whatever it likes. What we've discovered repeatedly, but still don't seem to have learnt from, is that the United States, for all its strength and power and creativity and all the good things about it, is not the power we thought it was and the power we hoped it would be.
大家好，我是老吴。最近澳大利亚总理阿尔巴尼斯访问中国，但这次很不一样，他是顶着非常巨大的国内压力来的，甚至还没有出发，澳洲国内的保守派媒体就已经炸了锅，以天空新闻为首的右翼阵营批评毫不留情，说他软弱可欺，是个软蛋，说他被北京牵着鼻子走。这趟行程还被嘲讽是对中共的朝贡之旅，甚至还有人警告说他正把澳大利亚拖进一个战略陷阱。反对派自然也不会放过他，质问他，现在正是澳洲核协定项目推进，中美关系高度紧张的时候，你为什么偏偏要选择这个时候先去中国？有些朋友可能会觉得奇怪，澳大利亚和中国经济上互补，贸易往来这么密切，怎么会引发这么大的反对声音？这里我简单说一下，说白了，澳大利亚在很大程度上是美国的附庸，它有很多有影响力的智库，背后都有美国的资金支持。而这些智库说的话，常常反映的其实是美国的立场，而不是澳大利亚自己的利益。媒体就更是如此，比如最反华的天空新闻，它其实是默多克新闻集团旗下的，就像美国的 Fox News 一样，你说它能代表谁的利益？但就是在这样巨大的压力下，阿尔巴尼斯为什么还要坚持访华？因为在澳大利亚国内也同样存在着理性、清醒的声音，而且这种声音并不是现在才有，早在几年前，在最亲美、最反华的前总理莫里森还在台上的时候，就已经有人站出来质疑了。顺带提一下，莫里森下台后，直接去了美国人早就给他安排好的智库养老。这种政客化领养的安排，在美国控制下的盟国其实屡见不鲜。好了，话说回来，今天我想跟大家分享的就是这样一种清醒的声音，它来自一位澳大利亚非常有分量的战略学者休·怀特教授。这段演讲发生在2019年8月，怀特教授是澳大利亚前国防部副部长，也是历任总理的国防政策顾问，可以说是最了解澳洲国家战略的那批人。在这场演讲里，他提出了一个非常清醒的核心观点：澳大利亚继续追随美国的对华遏制政策是一个巨大的战略错误。他从两个层面分析为什么这个政策根本行不通。一，要么美国其实没那个决心去承受和中国长期对抗的巨大代价；二，要么美国真下了决心，那更糟，因为他根本打不赢，甚至可能引发灾难性的核冲突。那么怀特教授是怎么一步步推导出这个结论的？我们一起来听听他的分析。
That mantra that we've heard so much about over the last 10 years or so, we don't have to choose between America and China, always depended for its credibility on whether Washington and Beijing agreed. And if Washington and Beijing decided, or if either of them decided that we did have to choose, then we had to choose. And last weekend, if we'd been any doubt before, last weekend removed any doubt at all that, at least from Washington's point of view, and I would also say from Beijing's, we do have to choose. We do have to make some choices. And the choices we're talking about are very big ones. Because the US-China rivalry that we're seeing today, over which of them will be the primary power in the world's most dynamic region, is a very big strategic challenge indeed. It's the biggest challenge to Australia's strategic assumptions, I would argue, since the late 1930s. And that didn't end well. Now, it is, I believe, an oversimplification to see the choices which that confronts us with in the terms in which, for example, under relentless grilling from Tom Switzer on Sunday afternoon, the US Secretary of State characterised them as a choice between soya beans and security, a choice between the United States as our great ally and China as our great customer. It is true that there is a choice between prosperity and security in the way we manage this. But tonight I want to leave prosperity to one side. And I want to ask, what is best for our security? What choices do we face in terms of how best to manage our security over the years and decades to come in the light of this rivalry between the US and China? Is it best for us to support the United States in what appears to be its current policy of trying to contain China's challenge and restore the old US-led order which has served Australia so well? Or is it better for us not to support them and to try some other approach? I'll touch very briefly on what that other approach might be later. Now, just to be clear, this is not a conversation about what we'd like. If you ask me at least what I'd like American primacy in Asia to last forever. But what we need to have a conversation about is not what we'd like, but what we should prudently expect. And I don't think we can prudently expect that supporting the United States in the policy that it currently appears to be pursuing is the best way for us to proceed. And there is two reasons why I think that. The first is that I don't believe the United States itself is committed to it, and therefore it won't work. The second is that even if the United States is committed to it, it won't work, and it will lead to a disaster. Let me analyse those two, explore those two propositions in a little bit more detail. Why do I say the United States is not really committed to the policy of containing China and restoring the US-led order? Well, it's easy to assume it is, partly because they say so. That's what Secretary Pompeo, for example, was saying over the weekend. But I do tend, as a point of methodology, to discount what countries and their leaders and their political representatives say and look more carefully at what they do. So a stronger reason as to why the United States should be committed to preserving its leadership in Asia is that it's always done so before. That the United States, for a long time, a century you might say, has always been committed to preserving its position as the leading power in East Asia and more broadly to resisting challenges posed by peer competitors successively through the 20th century. And that is true. 1917, 1941, the decades of the Cold War, the United States has been pretty consistent. But the fact that that's what the United States has done before is no guarantee that that's what it'll do in the future. And it seems to me in particular that in the case of the contest with China, there are two key differences. The first is that China is stronger than any of the would-be peer competitors that the United States has ever faced before. It's stronger as an economic power, in particular, and I do take an old-fashioned view that economic weight is the foundation of national power. That is not to say that America isn't strong too. It's a very strong country, but China is stronger relative to the United States than any country has ever been since the United States first poked its nose out of the Western Hemisphere at the end of the 19th century. Its economy is far, far bigger, probably already now twice as big as the Soviet Union's was relative to America's at the height of the Cold War, and is likely to grow much bigger still. We would make a real mistake to keep on underestimating China's power for the next few years as we have done so consistently for the last 25 years. We face this predicament today because we've underestimated China's power for so long. And I might say we've overestimated the United States. For too long, we've taken it for granted that the United States is by definition the world's strongest state. By definition has the military power to do whatever it likes. What we've discovered repeatedly, but still don't seem to have learnt from, is that the United States, for all its strength and power and creativity and all the good things about it, is not the power we thought it was and the power we hoped it would be. And what that means is that the cost to the United States of preserving its leadership in Asia in the face of China's power and ambition to overtake it is going to be very high. It will be comparable to and perhaps higher than the cost of preserving its position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union during the Cold War because China is stronger. Now, the other side of the coin is that the imperatives to the United States are lower than they were in previous enterprises when it confronted peer competitors. And that's because in the past, when the United States has set out to defeat, for example, Wilhelmine Germany in 1917, or the Nazis and the Japanese in 1941, or the Soviets in 1948 and onwards, they confronted in each of those episodes powers which had a real prospect of dominating the whole of the Eurasian landmass. And any country that dominates the whole of the Eurasian landmass is easily going to be strong enough to threaten the United States at home in the Western Hemisphere. That provided a very deep foundational reason why the United States should be prepared to bear the burdens and pay the costs of confronting those very powerful states. But I think it's hard to argue that China has a prospect of doing that, because although I am pretty bullish about China, I think the chances of China having the kind of preponderance that would allow it to dominate the other countries in Eurasia are very low. Therefore, the chance of it being able to dominate Eurasia and threaten the United States at home in the Western Hemisphere are very low. And therefore, the chance of the United States having the will, the motive, the purpose to pay those higher costs and risks in order to confront China in East Asia, to prevent China becoming the primary power in East Asia, is pretty low. Because I just don't see why the United States should commit itself to those costs and risks. And moreover, there's no real sign that they are. There are people in Washington, including the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defence, who talk of a new Cold War or language like it. But I think they still underestimate China. I don't hear from them a clear understanding of how big that will be, a clear articulation of a strategy that would deliver America a reasonable prospect of success in confronting China. No clear recognitions of how much that will cost, and no clear statement of why the United States has to commit itself to paying those costs. And I haven't even mentioned Donald Trump. But Trump is an important part of this, not because, or not just because of his own policies, but because of what his election tells us about the attitude not of the foreign policy elites in Washington, D.C., but of American voters. Because in the end, a national effort on the scale and cost and risk required to confront a country as powerful as China in its own hemisphere is not something that can be decided by a few people in think tanks up and down Massachusetts Avenue. It needs to be decided by the American people as a whole. And what you see from the election of Donald Trump, what you see from the willingness of the Republican establishment to go along with him, and what you see on the Democrat side of politics as the Democrats try to redefine themselves in the Trump era, is very little commitment, if any, to preserving the US leadership role upon which this whole model of American engagement in Asia depends. In the light of all this, Australians have to ask themselves, how confident can we be that America today and in the decades to come will commit to the costs and risks of containing China? And what if I'm wrong? How sure can we be that they will succeed if I'm wrong and they do decide to commit? Because if I'm wrong, if America really is committed, then what we'll see is escalating strategic rivalry, further steps up the trend, the very sharply rising trend that we've seen in the last few months and years. Now, everyone in Washington and everyone in Australia, I guess, would hope that in the face of that, China would simply back off. But I think that underestimates China again. The balance of resolve favours China, for the simple geographical reason that the contest we're talking about is one in East Asia. If the contest was in the Western Hemisphere, I wouldn't give China a chance. But in China's backyard, where the balance of resolve is so strongly shaped by geography, I think the chances of China backing off before America does are very low. That means if America sticks to the commitment, the chance of war goes up. It's quite high in this scenario. Over an issue like Taiwan, in a sense, it doesn't really matter what the issue that starts it is. What's important is that the US and China will find themselves fighting a conflict whose essential driver is the question as to which of them is the primary power in Asia, a very old-fashioned conception of a hegemonic war. If that happens, America will not win easily. In fact, I think the chances are America will not win at all. It won't lose. In a sense, the PLA is not going to march down the Constitution Avenue in the United States, but it will not win. And in failing to win, in failing to resolve, the old order in Asia will be destroyed anyway. Moreover, the chance of that conflict escalating to a nuclear conflict is quite high. And the chance of that becoming a full-scale nuclear exchange is quite high. So if I'm wrong, if America is committed, that leads Asia and Australia directly to what looks to me like a very serious catastrophe. In neither case, whether America's committed or it isn't, are Australia's security interests served by supporting and encouraging current US policy. So will we anyway? I've just explained what we should do. What will we do? Well, I don't know, actually. It's very easy for us to keep trying to slide along as we're doing at the moment without making a choice on this, being actually systemically duplicitous, telling the United States that we are supporting them and telling the Chinese that we're not. That is Australia's policy today. I think whether we can resolve that, whether we can come out and actually say, no, we're not going to go down this path the United States is talking about following, is going to be hard. It's very easy to slide into supporting the United States through timidity and a lack of imagination. It's easy to say we have no choice, as people keep on saying. That's simply wrong. We do have a choice. We do have a choice. We haven't yet made that choice yet. But what is notable to me is that Australian government so far, including the present government, have so far failed to endorse the American designation of China as a strategic rival. They haven't done so yet, not I think because of a kind of strategic argument I've just unfolded, but for the simpler reason, going back to Mr. Pompeo, of fear of China's anger and what it would mean for our trade relationships. But I think what that shows is they're still hoping to muddle through. And I think this is true of both sides of politics. And that does remind me of the 1930s, because if you look at what Australia did as things darkened in the late 1930s, Australian political leaders recognised that the Singapore strategy, the continuing dependence on the United Kingdom, to which we are so heavily committed, was not working. But we simply couldn't imagine doing anything else. And so we slid into the fall of Singapore and the biggest catastrophe in our national history. So what should we do? Well, two possibilities. One is that we should go back to the United States and say, we don't think the policy you're working on at the moment is going to work. But we can encourage them to develop one that will. And it is possible to imagine a US policy which recognised China's growing power, which was sustainable at a level of effort the United States is prepared to commit. It would be a very different US role in Asia than one we've seen in the past, but it would be much better for us than the United States withdrawing, which seems to be the most likely alternative. I think there was a time, around about 2012, when Australia could have done that, could have gone out there and argued for that different model. And if you look at, for example, at what Lee Hsien Loong was talking about in his big speech in Singapore on the 1st of June this year, that was the kind of thing he was talking about. And we could do that, and maybe we should. But I'm here to tell you, I think the time has passed. I think the chances of that succeeding is now very low. So what should we do instead? Prepare for how best we can manage our security if that fails, which means prepare to stand alone. Thank you very much.
好，怀特教授的这段演讲就分享到这里。他的分析非常理性，也非常深刻。他指出了澳大利亚当前面对的几个核心困境。第一，他质疑美国真的有意志去遏制中国。中国今天的实力远远强于当年的苏联，而遏制这样一个国家的代价可能是巨大的。更关键的是，中国不像苏联那样有称霸全球的野心，遏制它的必要性反而没那么高。高成本、低必要性的战略，美国能坚持多久？怀特对此表示怀疑。第二，他做了一个关键的推演：如果美国真的决心遏制中国，那结局可能更可怕。因为在中国的家门口，中国有决心、有优势，美国想靠武力压制，很可能适得其反，甚至点燃一场升级为核冲突的灾难。所以他得出了一个很多亲美派难以接受，但却非常合理的结论：无论美国是战是和，澳大利亚继续盲目追随美国，都只会把自己推向危险的深渊。他说的特别直白，澳大利亚知道这套跟着美国走的老路其实已经走不通了，但却缺乏勇气和想象力去探索一条新的道路。怀特教授最后的建议是，澳大利亚要做好准备，独立站稳脚跟。好，今天的分享就到这里，感谢大家的收看，我们下次再见。